Good Shabbos. This week's portion is Vayakel, but instead of talking about the portion, I'm going to talk about current events, but trying to understand it through the lens of Megillas Esther, the story of Esther, and specifically the character of Haman, since Purim is coming up in just a few weeks. And the current events are what's happening in the Ukraine and with Putin. And I'd like to sort of see if leaders like Putin could be compared to past leaders and Haman being used as somewhat of a paradigm. So first, I'd like to understand what was going on with Haman's decisions. First, when Mordechai refuses to bow down to him, he says he's not going to just take the life of Mordechai. That seemed to be beneath him, but rather he'll just wipe out the entire nation of the Jewish people. Later on, after he has the first feast or banquet together with Esther and Achashverosh, and he sort of seems to be at the height of his power, and he sees Mordechai not refusing to bow down to him, at that time he says, I'm going to take Mordechai's life by himself as an individual, even before I go through with my plan to wipe out the Jewish people. So the question is, what changed? And it always bothered me, why wouldn't he kill Mordechai in the first place? And I think the answer might be very simple. It would be too petty and too personal to be able to just to say, I want to kill Mordechai. He has to come to Achashverosh, who's the king, with a plan. He has to have a reason. And he's going to sound like all he cares about is his own selfish needs. This Mordechai refuses to bow down to me, and therefore I'm going to kill Mordechai. That's not the interests of Achashverosh, it's not the interests of the Persian Empire, it's only the interests of Haman. And therefore he couldn't let it focus on himself. So the only way to kill Mordechai is to come up with a plan to kill the whole Jewish people. And he comes to Achashverosh and he gives him 3 reasons why the Jewish people are not deserving to survive, and let's wipe them out. But what happens? He becomes a little bit too full of himself. He becomes arrogant. He becomes overconfident. And that's exactly the plan, it seems, of Esther, of inviting Haman together with Achashverosh to Seudah, to a banquet, and it's only him. And what happens is he realizes that he is the power. He is the one who controls everything. Of course, he's still beneath Achashverosh, but he's sort of right there at the pinnacle of power, and his confidence starts brimming over, and his arrogance plays a larger role in his decisions. And he realizes that, you know what, I could be selfish and do things on my own for myself because I'm so powerful, no one's going to stop me. And I'm so convinced that I could do whatever I want, it's exactly what I'll do. And that's the downfall of Haman. And it's understood that way, I think, in some of the commentaries of the Megillah, that Haman represents not just an evil man, but he represents the epitome of evil, which is in arrogance, in a lack of humility. And that lack of arrogance is really the heart and the soul of what evil really is. And that's also the downfall of evil people. When someone gets so arrogant and so confident in himself that he feels he can make no mistake, that's when you get him, and that's when he falls. That's when his whole life will starts to fall and collapse around him, because nobody should be so confident. The world does not revolve around any particular individual, and when you think it does, and you think you cannot make any mistakes, that's when you make your greatest mistake. And that's what Esther perhaps was planning, and how the Megillah plays out. And then it's exactly where the downfall starts. He wants to kill Mordechai, and instead Achashverosh turns the tables on him, and he has to lead Mordechai through the streets in royal attire. And if you look at history, in a sense, that arrogance is what makes many wicked people to collapse. And that's an example perhaps best explained for Hitler. Again, oversimplification of history. But if you think about it, Hitler, of course, was not acting only for his own selfish needs, at least on the surface. He was trying to create something for the German people, and he made a deal with Russia, actually, at the time. And he would split Poland with Russia, and they would be allies because he couldn't fight all the powers in the West and the powers in the East at the same time. But then what happens is he becomes overconfident, and he says, I could do no wrong. And he attacks Russia also, and that's his downfall. Because when you surround yourself with just people who say you're right and they're fearful of arguing with you, rationality starts to fall to the wayside, and you just focus on yourself and your own selfish needs and believe you can't do anything wrong. And that's the downfall. Now, of course, with Hitler is different than the story of Haman. The story of Haman and Esther is beautiful in the sense that nothing ever happens. It's all just a plan, and it all collapses before the plan comes to fruition. With Hitler, obviously, that didn't happen. And in real life, in everyday life that we live, these things, if they do happen, sometimes do take a long time, whether it's a few months or a few years or even a number of decades. It could be a long time before these evil empires, so to speak, do collapse around their own sense of overconfidence and lack of humility and arrogance. But I think that's a large ingredient in the collapse of these great evil people. And perhaps, as many commentators are saying, that's what's happening with Putin today, is that as he gains confidence in himself and he sees he can get away with more and more, and he surrounds himself in a bubble with people who are only going to acquiesce to everything he says and agree with him because they're fearful to disagree, because you know what happens to people who disagree with him. His decisions become more of arrogance than rational. Now, at this point in the story of Russia, you could say it is rational because he seems to be successful. He's gotten away with many, many, many things that he's done in regard to personal enemies and all kinds of other adversaries that he faces, and he's been somewhat successful. And it could be he'll be successful no matter how much we hope not. He'll be successful for a good number of months or years or even for another decade or two, just like the Soviet Empire lasted for a long while. And the communist communist China also was able to survive and still survives now in not necessarily being this bright light of democracy. Right? It might take a long time for the collapse to happen. Hopefully not. But what people seem to be understanding of Putin is that he's making mistakes because he doesn't understand maybe what his own people are willing to do and go along with. And he also doesn't understand necessarily how the nations of the world will respond. He might be right in the short term, and perhaps the international reaction to some of his past deeds was a little weak, and therefore it led him to believe that he could be successful. These are all questions which are better suited to some expert in international affairs. But in the long run, my hope is that eventually people like that cannot succeed. It's just a question of time till everything collapses around him. And in another sense, I think if you study Maimonides and his idea of messianic times, and he says the idea of a Messiah coming basically as benign king who brings peace and knowledge to the world, and that kingdom will last forever. That government will last forever. How could he say that? No governments seem to last forever. The answer might be that, at least in the ideal world that Maimonides is creating in the Messianic time, is exactly the opposite of the figures we're talking about, but rather a king or a leader who will be someone who doesn't act selfishly, but acts lishma, so to speak, for the right reasons, for the good of the world, and acts with rationality, and wants peace, and wants to give and wants to spread sort of the wealth around and the goodness that comes with knowledge and perhaps democracy those things will last forever because the reasons that usually undermine these types of leaders would not exist in those messianic times. And that maybe is the hope that we have that was not seen in the time of the Megillah, because Achashverosh was not overthrown, only Haman. Hitler might have lost the war, but there's still many evil empires and countries and leaders that still exist. There's much to be done in this world. And we see it now, that although we had a hope when the Soviet Union sort of collapsed over 30 years ago, history is not going always in the direction that we hope for. But it doesn't mean that it's not going overall in the right direction. It's sort of like the stock market. There's ups and downs, but eventually it seems to go up. The housing market. The world might have real low points, as it did in World War II and with Hitler, and perhaps now we're seeing another low point. But it doesn't mean that eventually we're going in the right direction. And that's the optimistic view of the history of the world. Hopefully, we'll see that soon, and hopefully it's sooner rather than later. Good Shabbos.